Thank you, Jason. My name's Palab Ghosh. I'm one of the BBC science correspondents, and thank you all for coming to this wonderful institution. As Jason said, this is the venue where great scientists such as Sir Humphrey Davy kind of gave lectures on some of the great cutting-edge ideas of our time, and it's nice to see it's still being used for that, because today we have Jared Diamond talking about the ideas in his new book, The World Until Yesterday. He's an author who, through his writings, has made us think about our societies and how they came to be. And in his latest book, he writes about what we can learn from traditional societies. And so the structure of this evening is that Jared will spend a few minutes just outlining some of the ideas in his new book, and then we'll have a conversation about it. And then in about an hour or so, you'll get your chance to ask some questions. And then afterwards, don't run away, because Jared will be signing copies of his latest book at the end. But so first of all, Jared, could you just, in a few minutes, summarise some of the ideas in your book?
I certainly can summarise the ideas in my book in a few minutes, because when I started, after being a laboratory scientist, also being a popular science author, I found myself confronted with journalists who would say to me things like, "Mr. Diamond, I know that you spent 5 years of your life reviewing the last 11,000 years of human history and reading hundreds of books to put into it, but Mr. Diamond, remember that our TV viewers are busy people, so please would you summarize 11,000 years of history in one sentence?"
We have a few more than that.
But nevertheless, I will summarize my book for you, certainly in less than 3 minutes and 15 seconds. My current book arose as an autobiographical book of what I've observed in my work in New Guinea in the last 50 years. My field work as an ornithologist has been on the island of New Guinea, that big tropical island north of Australia, where until recently, everybody was still using stone tools and living outside the limits of state government and didn't have writing. So there's much in New Guinea, even nowadays, that is like how the world has operated until recently, because what we think of as the modern industrial world, with writing and central government and living in permanent housing and growing our food, that's something that began only in the last 11,000 years, but there have been humans for 6 million years. New Guinea is very diverse, 1,000 different groups. They're very different from each other. My book then morphed from an autobiographical account of what I've observed in New Guinea to a discussion of traditional societies. That's the small traditional societies that filled the world until relatively recently, traditional societies around the world. And therefore the book is based on studies of 39 traditional peoples on all the continents by anthropologists and sociologists and political scientists, then colored and laced with anecdotes of my experiences in New Guinea. Partly, then, the motivation for writing the book is that New Guinea is just so fascinating. New Guineans are such interesting people. On the one hand, they're similar to us. They laugh, cry, and they're scared at the same time that I am. But in other respects, they're very different. And then the book is also about the things that I've learned and that others have learned from traditional societies. These traditional societies around the world are like thousands of different experiments in how to run a human society. Every society with state government is convergently similar, whether it's Chinese, Indian, or Israeli, but traditional societies are very varied. And for me in particular, how I brought up my children and my attitudes towards danger and how I contemplate growing older and my lifestyle and diet have been strongly influenced by what I've observed in New Guinea. So the book is partly because traditional societies are so interesting, and partly it's that we can learn things, I think, that can help ourselves from some of the things that go on in traditional societies. There's my 3 minutes and 15 seconds.
Well done. Thank you very much. So we're going to explore some of these ideas, but you've got a lot of your fans here. And one of the things I'm sure they want to know is what got you started down this track? Because you've written a series of books that have been quite insightful about the way in which societies have been shaped, that have been driven by the forces of geography and the environment. What got you to this point?
It was not a straight line. As a child, I got interested in birds, but my father was a physician. And so as I was growing up, when people asked me, what are you going to do when you grow up? The natural answer was, I'll be a doctor like my father. When I then went to university, in my last year in university, having prepared to read medicine, in my last year I finally realized I don't want to practice as a doctor, but I had already begun laboratory research, and so it was an easy segue to go into laboratory physiology. And in fact, I moved from Boston to Cambridge, England, which at that time led the world in laboratory physiology. I became the world's expert on the gallbladder. And from 1966 to 2002, I was professor of physiology at University of California, Los Angeles, teaching kidney and intestinal physiology to medical students.
It's not an obvious leap to the kind of things you're writing about now.
It definitely is not an obvious leap. The stages of the leap were that once I completed my PhD at Cambridge and came back to Harvard, it dawned on me with horror that although I enjoyed and was good at doing gallbladder research, I was expected to devote the rest of my life to the gallbladder, and that wasn't a big enough field. So I made a trip to Peru with a friend, ended up studying birds in the Amazon, then went to New Guinea for adventure, but to study birds in 1964. And then gradually, I got interested in New Guineans. Why is it that these smart people ended up with the stone tools? Eventually, a New Guinean asked me straight out, why did you white people come here with the cargo and the metal tools? And then particularly once my children were born, when my twin sons were born in 1987, I just gradually lost interest in things that I could not see, molecules and cells. I got more concerned about human societies and what the state of the world is going to be like when my own children are 70 and 80 years old. And so I began writing about problems of human societies, environmental history, closed my gallbladder laboratory in 2002, moved to the geography department at UCLA, and now I teach geography to undergraduates. I don't do gallbladders, I still do New Guinea bird work, and I still write books about human societies.
Well, we're delighted you made that choice. But so it was to kind of try and observe and hopefully influence the development of our current human society. Is that your motivation? Was that what you saw right at the beginning?
I would not say it was my motivation. The motivation for me has always been just the fascination of these people, these different people, and the fascination of the world, the fascination of understanding the world. But when one understands the world, you can also see the familiar problems in the world, what's going to happen to the world if we continue consuming at the rate we're consuming now. We're consuming unsustainably. There are big differences in standard of living around the world, and that's not going to be tolerated in coming decades. And so I've also then began to write about what we could learn from history in order to ensure a better future for my children and their generation.
And of course, you acknowledge in your writings that we can't wind the clock back. We can't go back to living in some of those traditional societies, but we can learn from traditional societies.
We can learn from traditional societies, and a worst case scenario would be that we wind the clock back not because of our own choice. When one tries to picture what the world is going to be like 30, 40 years from now, because we're already consuming at an unsustainable rate. If we carry on at this rate, we'll run out of both renewable and non-renewable resources within a few decades. And worst case scenario is that the world ends up in nuclear war, and a slightly less worst case scenario is that we lose the ability to sustain a first world civilization and we relapse to traditional societies, in which case the people who will be best off are New Guineans because they know how to make stone tools and I don't.
So what is your way forward? Is it to kind of tweak our societies, if you like, from some of the observations that you've made?
I would use a stronger word than tweak. I would say kick. I'm on the boards of directors of two wonderful international conservation organizations, World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International, both of which are devoted to trying to show us how and to help us get onto a sustainable path.
And your comments are particularly pertinent now after the IPCC's first report and the call to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and so it's very pertinent. But let's take some of these ideas in turn. One of the things you talk about in studying particularly the people of New Guinea is their different ideas of assessing risk. So tell me about that.
That's the different approach of New Guineans to assessing risk is perhaps the aspect of living in New Guinea that has most affected my personal life and that most separates me from most Americans who don't understand my New Guinea-based attitude. The moment of truth for me was that in one of my early trips to New Guinea, I was with a batch of New Guineans on a mountain studying birds. We moved up the mountain. I was ready to pick a new campsite, and I found a gorgeous potential campsite in forest, flat top of a ridge, steep drop-off where I could watch parrots and pigeons underneath a giant tree. And so I told the New Guineans, let's pitch camp here. And to my surprise, they refused to pitch camp there. What's the matter? And they said, look, this tree is dead. So I looked up, and yes, this giant tree was dead, but I said, that's ridiculous. It's not going to fall for 40 years. But they were adamant they were not going to sleep under a dead tree. In fact, they slept in the open. I thought that they were being paranoid with exaggerated fears. And then as I spent more time in New Guinea, every night you're in New Guinea, sleeping in the forests, you hear a tree fall somewhere, and then you go do the numbers. Suppose the risk of that tree falling on me tonight is 1 in 1,000. But if I sleep under dead trees for 1,000 nights, in 3 years, I'm going to be dead. And that brought home the New Guinea attitude is to be sensitive to the risks of events, of things that you're going to do regularly. Each time they carry a low risk, but if you're not cautious, it will catch up with you. And the example in Western life for me now is taking a shower. The most dangerous thing I did today was to take a shower, and you may say, that's ridiculous, Jared, your chance of falling in the shower is 1 in 1,000. But again, do the numbers. I'm 76, statistically I have 15 years ahead of me. That means 5,475 showers ahead of me. If my risk of breaking my leg in the shower is 1 in 1,000, I'm going to kill myself 5.5 times before I live out my life expectancy. And so I'm careful about showers, I'm careful about sidewalks, I'm careful about step ladders. It drives many of my American friends crazy, but I will survive and they won't.
Well, we're glad to hear it. But they're the crazy ones, really, because they're worried about other things.
Americans, what we
We're
Americans...
not just Americans, us too.
We Americans and you British are people in the first world in general are obsessed about terrorists, plane crashes, GM crops, DNA, and what we should be worrying about, but those kill negligible numbers of people. How many Americans or British have died of terrorists in the last 50 years? The real risk to us are those things that we do daily, and each time the risk is low, but they'll catch up with us. The real risk to us are cars, alcohol, step ladders, stairs. Today I was in the BBC. I don't know if you've seen that tight spiralist stairs.
Yes, I worry about it myself every time I go down there.
I refused to go up it.
Jared's right, it's extremely dangerous. I've often wondered they should turn it into helter-skelter so you could slide down when you need to. But But why do you think we've become so disconnected? Is it the media's fault? Is it because people watch the news and see terrorist attacks and reports in newspapers that mobile phones might cause cancer? Or have we become disconnected from the real risks?
Interesting question. My guess is that there are two reasons why we've got disconnected from the real risks. One is the reality that life is less dangerous for us than New Guineans, as measured by the fact that our lifespans are longer. Our chances of dying each year are lower because New Guineans face risks from falling trees, crocodiles, pigs, stinging ants, starving, all that other stuff. The risk of first world life is lower. The other thing is that when something bad happens to us, often, usually, it can be fixed in hospitals. We can get to hospitals quickly, whereas in New Guinea, if you fall down and break your leg, probably it's 3 days walk from the nearest airstrip. You won't get to the airstrip, and without modern medicine, there's not someone to set your leg, and therefore you'll end up permanently crippled. So New Guineans have to think clearly about dangers, and for us, danger is less acute, and we have the attitude that damage can be fixed, and therefore we think in a muddled way about danger.
And another thing that you've observed is a different attitude towards children. Tell us about, and you've got a personal experience of that as well. First of all, how do New Guineans regard the upbringing of children?
That's perhaps the other way in which working in New Guinea has most affected me, namely in how my wife and I brought up our own children. In New Guinea and other traditional societies, children in general are given much more independence and responsibility for their decisions from a very young age. It goes to an extreme. Babies playing near fires. The baby is expected to take responsibility for figuring out not to roll into a fire. Well, my wife and I didn't go to that extreme, but young children in New Guinea are expected to make their own decisions. They become self-confident. They'll negotiate with adults at age 5 or 10. They'll make their own decisions, whereas in the US and UK, we micromanage our kids. Last night, I was at an event where the journalist with whom I did the event mentioned that his 7-year-old daughter is in a school where one of the mothers pointed to her own 7-year-old daughter and said, "I know what my daughter is going to do when she grows up. My daughter, I want her to become an economist and go to Harvard." Well, in New Guinea, that's unthinkable. A child makes his or her own decisions. So in our case, we let our kids decide what they wanted as much as possible. And when my son Max was 3 years old, he saw his first snake. It was dead. It was love at first sight. My wife and I are not snake lovers, but Max picked up that snake, carried around the dead snake for a week and a half. Then he demanded a pet snake. Then he demanded another pet snake and a turtle, and finally built up to 147 pet snakes, frogs, reptiles, amphibians, and salamanders. And he made his own decisions. And after 10 years, he lost his interest in snakes, but eventually when he graduated college, 2 months after graduating, he called us up and said, "I've decided I'm going to become a chef, and I'm entering culinary school tomorrow." This is a boy who grew up making his own decisions and not being told by his parents what he's going to do.
So do you think that's the thing that we're losing in our society? I mean, by the way, I think there are a lot of people here that have 5 to 10-year-olds whom they have to do a lot of negotiating with. I certainly do. But by micromanaging our children, being too concerned about their choices, what do you think we're losing?
Well, what our children are losing is the confidence to make their own decisions. People who work in traditional societies in general, whether they're in Africa or in New Guinea, all of us who've worked in traditional societies are struck by the precocity of the children in the traditional societies, by their creativity, by their comfort in making their own decisions, by their skill in negotiating. Already at 5 and 10 years old, these 10-year-old New Guinea kids can out-negotiate a European lawyer who comes in there. So what our kids lose is self-confidence and the ability to make their own decisions. There's no surprise then that when they come to be teenagers, and their bodies are the bodies of adults. Their mentality is not the mentality of adults, and so our kids go through teenage crises where I've never seen a New Guinea kid or African kid go through a teenage crisis.
And so how do you think this came to be in our society? Was it always like this? I kind of seem to remember that when I was growing up, I perhaps had a bit more freedom than I give to my own child, that children were allowed to kind of go a bit further and do their own thing. And now in the past 30, 40 years, we've become more nervous about our children, more concerned about them.
That's an interesting question, and I don't fully understand the answer to it. Part of it is that in modern industrial society, we have formal education. There's a lot that a kid has to learn in order to be able to get a job and to cope with society. So a kid can't run around and do whatever the kid wants. The kid goes through school, and there are things that you learn at school, and that's necessary in order to end up with a career. So we have to strike a balance between marching children through what they have to learn, but at the same time giving them as much freedom as possible.
I have to say, I mean, like your anecdote, I feel a little bit nervous about giving my daughter too much freedom, because she'll perhaps not do her homework or not go to bed on time and be tired the next day. But you've got to start giving in order to get some of those responsible people growing up, I guess.
I must say, I had my children late in life. My twins were born just short of my 50th birthday. And I didn't have much experience with kids, whereas my wife did. And so I did not know how if we gave our kids New Guinea-type freedom, how we would get them to do the things that they really had to do. Both my wife and I were adamant that we were never going to, you say smack, we say spank our kids. And so in my life, we never hit our kids. Somehow they did what was necessary to do. Somehow we could talk them into it. Occasionally we put them on what we called time out. That's to say, we said, go up to your bedroom for 5 minutes. But it was symmetrical. Once I did something of which my children disapproved, namely there was a squirrel in our fruit tree, and I raised a stick and I hit at the squirrel, and my son Max got very angry, and he said, "Daddy, you're on time out. Go up to your bedroom, and you cannot read. You just have to sit there."
And did you?
I did.
And now let's move on to the attitudes towards the elderly. So, just describe what happens in New Guinea.
Attitude towards the elderly in traditional societies is more varied than in modern industrial society. It can be, the treatment of the elderly can either be much worse or more often it's much happier. In some traditional societies, particularly nomadic ones, or ones where periodically there just isn't enough food, there is no alternative except to abandon the elderly when you move camp because you can't carry them plus the children, or to encourage the elderly to commit suicide, or to stop feeding them, or in the worst case, to kill them against their will. That's exceptional, but it happens in some nomadic traditional societies and traditional societies with fluctuating food supply. Much more often in traditional societies which are sedentary, where people live out their lives in a village or they move on marriage and then stay there. Older people then spend their adult years surrounded by their relatives and by their friends of childhood, whereas in modern industrial society, the average American moves every 5 years. And so in my city, there is not Los Angeles, there's not a single person whom I knew, except for my sister, whom I knew before I was 10 years old. There are a few people that I knew in high school and college. We don't have these lifelong relationships that one has in a traditional society. And that's why friends of mine say who've worked in Africa sum it up by contrasting Africa with the first world and saying life in Africa is materially poorer, but it's socially richer.
And part of that richness is due to the experience of the older people there that are the repositories of knowledge.
The older people have a more satisfying life. And yes, they're a repository of knowledge in two senses. One is that the first writing in human history wasn't until 3,400 BC. And even within the last few centuries, there were lots of societies that were non-literate societies. In a non-literate society, the knowledge is the memories of old people. If you want to know something, you can't look it up in a book, you can't Google it. Memory is the knowledge of old people about what's dangerous and the plants and animals and everything else. So that's a traditional value of old people, which has disappeared today, because if you want to know what is the capital of France, you don't look for the nearest 80-year-old on the street, you look it up in the encyclopedia. But older people have lifelong experience. Young people don't have lifelong experience. Young people are better at doing some things. They have more energy, they have physical stamina. They can operate the 41-button remote on the television, which I cannot do. But on the other hand, by the time you're 76, you've seen lots of stuff, you've got lifelong experience, you've seen more of human relations, you've got your own ego out of the way in advising other people, you've had much more experience at supervising and administering. So older people in our society have unique values, unique roles to play that younger people just are not competent to fill.
And you think that that knowledge should be brought back in a more formal way, or do you think we should just kind of try and treat them with a bit more respect and consult them? Because, well, we can get knowledge through the internet. We can't get experience. We can't, you've got to go and ask people about human relationships and how to deal with specific problems.
It needs to be brought back in a formal way, or at least we need to do something formal about cutting off the options. In the United States, until about 20 years ago, it was routine to have mandatory retirement age. My father, who was
as we had here.
Right, and I'm not clear, do you still have mandatory retirement age in the UK?
I think you can sort of, people do tend to work longer, and more employers are giving people the opportunity to work beyond 65.
Okay.
But they can make you retire at 65 if they want to.
All right. In the United States, it is illegal to make someone retire at age 65 unless there's a physical reason for it, such as being a commercial airplane pilot. I know that in Germany, it's still the case that my German academic friends, professors, they're forced to retire at age 62 or 65 when they're at the peak of their abilities. So the first thing to do when you ask, is there something formal to do about it? The first thing to do is to abolish laws inflicting mandatory retirement. I'm not saying that everybody who's 65 years old should continue working whether they like it or not, but they should have the option to continue working, getting the satisfaction of working. If they enjoy their work, by all means, go do something else if they want to retire, but if they enjoy their work, use their experience and pass on their knowledge to the rest of society. It is a disaster for German society and for Swiss society that professors have to retire at age 65. And insofar as in the UK, there's pressure or requirement for people to retire at age 65, you are losing the experience of your most experienced people.
I suppose the kind of disrespecting of the elderly kind of gained momentum with the baby boomers. It was our generation that kind of developed the cult of youth, and as we're kind of getting a bit older ourselves, we're developing the cult of the middle-aged and the elderly. And so perhaps, what you're saying will start to come back naturally.
It certainly is true that we suffer from a cult of youth, I think more in the US than in the UK. But the way you all can test this for yourself, tomorrow morning, as you drive around, look at billboards. I think you call them advertising boards or billboards. And look at advertisements for Coca-Cola, beer, or anything else, and ask yourself how many of the ads depict 75-year-olds drinking Coca-Cola or beer. And the answer is going to be zero. Coke and beer ads always depict young people, even though older people buy and drink and pay for Coca-Cola and beer. Certainly in the United States, we have this cult of youth. If you want to sell something, have a young person. I just came back from Hong Kong and in China. China Coca-Cola ads also depict young people. So we have a cult of youth, And this shows up, unfortunately, in also getting jobs. Older people applying for jobs, if you put down in the job application you're 55 years old, and someone else puts down in the job application that they're 35 years old, the chances are twice as high that you can get called in for an interview if you're 25 to 40 than if you're 45 to 60.
And just moving on to some of the observations you've made about lifestyle and health, what can we learn from traditional societies on that?
Well, there we can learn something big. As I look around you today, I can predict with confidence that 95% of you are going to die of preventable, non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable diseases means lifestyle diseases, type 2 diabetes, heart attacks, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and hypertension. These are preventable diseases because they're diseases brought on by the Western lifestyle, and they kill most of us. But in traditional societies, in New Guinea, it happened that in 1961 there was a paper published on 2,000 admissions to the General Hospital in the capital of Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby. And among those 2,000 people, there was not a single case of heart disease, there was not a single case of diabetes, there were 3 cases of high blood pressure, and they were all not in New Guineans, but among immigrant people in New Guinea. So there's something about the traditional lifestyle that protects against these non-communicable diseases. And we know very well what it is. It is being physically more vigorous, consuming less salt, consuming less sugar, consuming a diet that's higher in fiber, that is less in starch, that's more in certain types of fat. Those of us Westerners who go on to these traditional type diets, they often or usually suffice to get rid of diabetic symptoms, even without taking insulin and other drugs. They suffice to reduce your cholesterol. They suffice to reduce your blood pressure. So that is something of practical value that we can learn from traditional societies.
And you were telling me about sort of an Aboriginal custom where if modern Aborigines kind of start getting diabetic symptoms, they've got their own cure and solution.
In Aboriginal Australia, there are still plenty of Aboriginal people who know how to live out in the bush, as they say, with gathering wild plant and animal foods. Aborigines, like really all people around the world except Europeans, when they adopt the Western lifestyle, they undergo epidemics of diabetes. The frequency of diabetes among urbanized Australian Aborigines is as high as 20 or 30%, which is triple that in the UK, for genetic reasons. And Aborigines, there are many groups of Aborigines now who do what they call go bush. They'll go out for a few weeks or even a few months and gather wild plants and animal foods. And during that time, they find that they lose weight, their diabetic symptoms regress. And so this just demonstrates that you can reverse the symptoms by going to a more traditional lifestyle. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm going to go out in the bush in Los Angeles and eat witchetty grubs, but my wife and I do not have a salt shaker. We simply do not have a salt shaker on the table in the kitchen. We do not have a sugar bowl in the kitchen. We eat lots of vegetables. We have a slightly New Guinea-like life. And I go to the gym 3 days a week, work out with my 26-year-old son, compare our numbers. His numbers are triple my numbers, but at least I go to the gym.
But there's a serious point in that modern Aboriginals still have that ancient knowledge of how to live in the bush. And are we essentially, many of the things you're talking about are a loss of culture that emanated from a traditional way of living. Is that something that you mourn?
Yes, it is. It is true. The reason I'm hesitating is that the reason that we Europeans and Americans have lost the knowledge of how to live traditionally is that living traditionally was generations in the past for us, whereas New Guineans and Aboriginal Australians, living traditionally has gone on in this generation. And so the knowledge the knowledge is there, it's easy to recover. Whereas for us Americans and Europeans, we don't know how to make stone tools. Some of my New Guinea friends know how to make stone tools.
And before we kind of go on to talk about possible solutions and how we can kind of deal with this, you made some interesting observations about their legal system.
Yeah, there's a basic difference between the legal system under state governments and the system of justice. One would not call it a legal system. The system of justice in traditional societies. Traditional societies do have a system of justice, do have systems of justice. People have disputes. The disputes have to be settled. There are things that are considered crimes. The crimes have to be dealt with. In our modern industrial societies, where there are thousands of people, and if there's a dispute, it's likely to be with a stranger whom you never saw before and you're never going to see again. The focus of the state is that the state has a monopoly on power. The last thing that the state government wants, the last thing that the British government wants, is if you have a dispute with your next door neighbor, you take it into your own hands and beat up or kill the next door neighbor. Instead, we have a system of justice in which the state takes that over, and so the state can say to you, you have no right and you have no need to punish your neighbor because we're going to do that. But the state is concerned with right and wrong and deterring and punishing. The state doesn't care at all about working out feelings between people who are strangers anyway. And any of you who've been involved in divorces or inheritance disputes, either in the UK or US, you know that the court system here doesn't care at all about whether a divorcing husband and wife end up speaking to each other or whether a brother and sister in an inheritance dispute end up speaking to each other. Whereas in traditional societies such as New Guinea, if there's a dispute, it's with someone in your village or someone next door that you have to deal with for the rest of your life. And so the focus is not on right and wrong. Who cares how much that pig was worth? Instead, the dispute is on emotional closure so that you can then deal with that person for the rest of your life. And now in the UK, particularly in the UK and Canada and New Zealand and Australia, to some extent in the US, there's an attempt to wed the advantages of the two types of justice systems with a movement called restorative justice. In restorative justice, you bring together, if they're willing, the criminal and the victim of the crime so that they can see each other as human beings rather than as stereotypes. And there was for example, in California, I relate in my book the story of a woman whose husband was killed by an incautious driver. And the driver was sent to prison for 11 years. And naturally, the woman was all torn up and the murderer was torn up. But through restorative justice, the widow and the driver agreed that they would meet in prison under highly controlled circumstances, scripted, nobody can scream at each other. The woman spent a couple of hours telling the killer of her husband what it was like to get the news of her husband's death. Every day she thinks of her dead husband when she sees a bicycle that her husband was riding or hears music, what it meant to her daughter to lose her father. And so the killer got to see what he had done to another person. And then the killer began to relate his life history, that he had been badly abused by his parents as a child, that he had gotten addicted to pain-killing drugs, that he had broken his back, that the night before he had run out of the pain-killing drugs and his girlfriend had deserted him. The next day he went out and then he confessed to the woman something that he never confessed in the trial. I killed your husband intentionally because I was so angry with everything that had happened in my life. But for him it meant a discharge, for the woman it meant a discharge. And the woman afterwards, the widow afterwards, said, forgiving is difficult, but not forgiving is harder. And that is a way to bring together the advantages of the traditional justice system, which aims at emotional clearance.
So it seems like that kind of system can work in larger societies. That it needn't be adversarial as it is in England and the United States.
That's correct. And there are experiments going on in the UK and in Canada and New Zealand to try to work out under what circumstances restorative justice works best. Should you do it at an early stage? Should you do it at a late stage? How should it be scripted, etc.?
And there are some people that don't feel guilt at all and it won't work with them at all.
Oh, that restorative justice works only if both parties are willing.
Yes.
And if either party is unwilling, then it's out of the question.
Yes.
And so it's tough if you're the widow. It's tough luck. You're not going to get clearance if your husband's murderer is unwilling to face you.
Yes. So it sounds like you've learnt a lot from your experience in New Guinea, and you've looked at literature of studies of other traditional cultures. But aren't you in danger of idealising traditional cultures?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, most of us swing between two extremes in our thinking about traditional cultures. At one extreme, many, particularly well-intentioned liberal people, idealize traditional cultures, think of them as being fonts of knowledge, peaceful, green, environmentalists, in tune with nature. And the opposite extreme is that lots of people, more in the past, but still today, there are lots of people in the first world who look down on traditional people as primitive brutes and barbarians who should be pushed out of the way, dragged into the modern world, whether they like it or not, have nothing to teach us, and should, in the past, in fact, it was routine to kill them. But the fact is that traditional people, they're people. They face the same problems that we do of childhood and danger in old age. In many respects, they're similar to us. In other respects, they're very different from us. There are thousands of different experiments in how to operate a human society. Some of the things that they do are terrible. The Kowloon people of Papua New Guinea, traditionally, when a man died, his widow called upon her brothers and sons to strangle her. I do not recommend that. There are other terrible things in traditional societies, but there are also wonderful things in traditional societies where we can learn.
And there's less and less chance of doing that because of the needs of globalization, the requirement for land. These people, these cultures, these ideas are being lost to us. Is that something that concerns you?
A great deal, that traditional knowledge, traditional culture is being lost, languages are being lost. The estimate is that the world is losing one language every 9 days, and at the rate we're going now, by the end of this century, the world's current 7,000 languages, 6,800 will be dead or will be spoken only by old people, won't be transmitted to children, and will be down to 200 languages. The 200 languages will be down to will be the languages of national governments, the official languages of Indian states, big languages like Arabic, but even big languages like Quechua, the language of the Inca Empire. Quechua is in the process of disappearing. So yes, I'm very concerned with the loss of languages, the loss of traditional knowledge, the loss of all these ways of bringing up children without spanking them, of ways of bringing up children so they're self-confident, of ways of getting value out of old people.
But the reason it's happening is that the modern way is a more efficient way of organising resources on the planet by having mass agriculture, mass trade, mass communication. Many people have benefited an awful lot from the modern world. You're not suggesting turning our back on it?
Absolutely not. I voted with my feet. I live in Los Angeles and I visit New Guinea. I don't live in New Guinea and visit Los Angeles. But there are big advantages to the modern world. We live longer, we have much more choice, we have medical care, we have education, we can travel and so on. But the fact that we have all those advantages doesn't mean that we have better ways of bringing up children and clearer ways of thinking about danger and better ways of treating old people. There are things that we can learn from traditional societies while retaining the advantages of our modern societies.
Well, can we have both? Or are we being driven into fitting into our allotted spaces in order for the global society to work as efficiently as possible? It is a clear choice, isn't it?
You're right. It's a crucial and difficult question. There are some things, some features of traditional life that we can easily adopt, and other things that are much harder to adopt. For example, this afternoon I was having a conversation with a woman, mother of a young child, and she, I think child, something like 16 months old. So in traditional societies, babies are weaned until they're 3 or 4 years old. Well, if you are a woman college professor or a lawyer, it won't do to make a plea to the jury while you're breastfeeding your child. So there are some things that are difficult to incorporate into our modern life, but there are, in traditional societies, it's common to have, it's routine to have the baby sleep in bed with the parents. There are many of us who would say, yes, I want my child to be independent, but I don't want my baby to sleep in bed with me. So there are things that are difficult for us to adopt. There are things that we may be reluctant to adopt, but there are other things that are easy to adopt, such as throwing away that salt shaker and giving your child more choice.
And so what are some of the, well, not so much the easy ones, but what are some of the slightly more difficult things that you feel we need to do to try and get the best of the traditional world and the modern world?
Okay. Easy things and difficult things. The easy things that we can do are things that we can do by ourselves that don't need any change in society, such as throwing away that salt shaker, giving your own children independence. But difficulties are that it's difficult to bring up your own children in a certain way, giving them more independence, if all the other children on the street are brought up another way. And so, for example, if you feel that if you do not want your children to watch television, and all the other kids on the street have television, and you forbid your child, and you don't have television in your house, you know what's going to happen is that your child is going to spend lots of time outside your house watching television in other houses. So that's an example of something that's more difficult. Most difficult are things that require changes in society. For example, abolishing mandatory requirement requires government action. Or getting the salt out of processed food. 2/3 of the salt in the food that we consume doesn't come out of our salt shaker. It's in the food in the supermarket because the food manufacturers have added the salt to make it more palatable and to be able to sell the food more cheaply. In order to get the salt out of processed food, that requires government action in concert with the food manufacturers. But in Finland and Portugal, in Finland over the last 30 years, the government has worked together with food manufacturers to reduce the level of salt in processed food, with the result that the incidence of heart attacks in Finland has dropped 70%.
So it's at all sorts of different levels, at an individual level and at the governmental level. But
exactly.
Do you believe we should watch less television? And do you think that we are getting a bit too attached to our iPhones and iPods, and we're being driven in a direction that's making us even less connected to the real world?
I hesitate to give a straight answer because of your own professional
Yes.
involvement at a high level of ability with these media. So I do not have a computer. I do not know how to turn on a computer. I do not have an iPhone. I have a 15-year-old cell phone that makes calls but not receives calls. When I am at dinner with my wife or with my children, they have my full attention, just as if this were a New Guinea conversation, whereas regrettably, when my children are over for dinner at our house, they are looking in their laps and they're text messaging, and we do not have their full conversation. Let me just tell you one story. I mean, it's a touching story about the tragedy that I see with the modern generation. So, my wife has Japanese relatives by marriage. And so I know well the life stories of our Japanese relatives. One of Marie's cousins, in Japan, until 50 years ago, arranged marriages were the rule. Now, Japanese, they date and they decide who they're going to marry. But the shift in Japan has occurred during the decades of the proliferation of the electronic media, which means that young Japanese have not acquired the social skills. So our cousin, our Japanese cousin, she was in a restaurant where sitting at a table were a young man and a young woman, and they were looking awkward, and they were obviously there on first date, but they were not talking to each other. They had their iPods or cell phones or whatever they are in their lap. And in alternation, one was duh-duh-duh and the other was duh-duh-duh. They were just too shy and awkward and inexperienced to speak to each other directly, and they could communicate only by text messaging. That's what I'm afraid of.
But are you seriously, so that's an extreme example, but do you think that iPhones and iPads, which many of us love, there are lots of things we can do. We can, communicate with people that we love more often, as well as sort of, get preoccupied in them. Do you think they're a bad thing? They take us in a wrong direction?
Then they're not a wholly bad thing, but they have both good sides and bad sides. And I think people are insensitive, unaware of the negative effects of media, which mean that you're communicating with other people not face-to-face, you're not reading the visual cues, you're not even getting the auditory cues because you're typing it in. And the reality is that many people, at least in the United States, are addicted to the media. My wife is a clinical psychologist, and so I know that there's a specialty of clinical psychology. This sounds like a joke, but it's what's the word? It's de-addicting, instead of de-addicting drug addicts, it's de-addicting technology addicts, the technology addict. So you de-addict a person by sending them off for, this sounds like a joke, but you send them off for the weekend. And in the first hour, they are going through horrible withdrawal symptoms because they can't do their stuff. But they have to learn that you can sit at the dinner table and you can actually look someone in the face and talk to them. And you can learn to read someone's expression and you can learn to read their voice. I am seriously concerned that the younger generation is losing.
And I suppose that's one of the things that you valued in your time in New Guinea, sort of being around a table, the family around a table and eating and talking rather than being preoccupied by the things.
In New Guinea, conversations are face-to-face conversations. When I'm talking with a New Guinean, he or she is not looking in his lap and punching away the buttons. I've got his or her full attention because there's nothing else. There's no television, there's no radio, there's nothing else.
It's liberating, in your view.
It's liberating, but a consequence is that when these New Guinea villagers who've never been out of their village, and they've never even had a primary school education, when the international lawyers from Chevron came in to negotiate with these illiterate villagers about the lease for the oil properties, the international business managers thought that they were going to walk all over the New Guineans in their negotiations. And instead, the negotiating skills of these New Guineans were incredible. They drove the international lawyers crazy. They would make agreements and then abrogate the agreements the next day. They would say something and then they would turn it around and they had a whole panoply of negotiating techniques that the lawyers didn't have. And the result was that the New Guineans drove the international lawyers crazy and they got everything they wanted.
Well, I will open it up for questions in a moment, so do have a think what you'd like to ask Jared. But before I do that, I'm sure a lot of people here will want to know, even just as your new book is out, what's next for you?
What's next for me? Inevitably, the next is another book. So I've already signed a contract for my next book. And thank God my contract for my next book is with the same UK publisher that has published my current book. My next book is on nations in crisis. Where I got into this was that, so I was born in 1937. I first visited the UK in 1950. I lived in the UK between 58 and 62. And in retrospect, Britain was going through decades of national reappraisal. And it was a tough time in the 1950s. But Britain has come out with a different identity. You no longer have the world's largest empire. You no longer have the world's biggest economy. But Britain has found a new identity. So the new book is going to be about national reappraisal, looking at Britain, Japan, Germany, the US, possibly Chile, possibly Indonesia, but starting off, because my wife is a clinical psychologist, with individuals in crisis, it turns out that the predictors of whether a nation is going to succeed in solving its crisis, most of those predictors are the same as the predictors of whether an individual in crisis psychotherapy will succeed in dealing with a crisis, with a couple of things added, that for nations, there's the issue of leadership and there's the issue of group dynamics that don't operate at the individual level.
And so what are the individual factors that nations should pay attention to when trying to reevaluate themselves or reposition themselves?
The individual factors include an honest appraisal of one's national strengths and one's weaknesses. What can my country realistically do? Britain concluded that realistically it could no longer control the world seas. That was an honest reappraisal. Another thing is flexibility as opposed to rigidity. There's national rigidity, there's individual rigidity. Individuals and nations that are flexible have a better chance of making changes than inflexible individuals and nations. And a wonderful, a really touching story that to me illustrates British flexibility. Winston Churchill tells the story. During the Blitz, the Germans dropped delayed fuse bombs, and these delayed fuse bombs in 1940, they had to be dug up and defused, and this was very dangerous. And Winston Churchill tells the story of, I think it was the Earl of Sussex, who was an aged gentleman with his aged secretary and his aged chauffeur, and the three of them went around defusing bombs, and they were very good at it, and they defused 33 bombs successfully. The 34th blew them up and killed them. But to me, that's a wonderful metaphor of British flexibility. I'm serious. Someone without any background in this area learning how to defuse bombs. And I think that flexibility in Britain, which you don't find in some other countries, is part of the reason why Britain has dealt relatively well in the last 50 years with adopting to your new world situation.
It sounds like it's going to be a fascinating read. Have you got a working title for it? Or will we have to wait?
I think I shall be tactful and leave you in suspense.
Okay, well, so now it's your turn. What I think I'll do is I'll ask, 3 or 4 of you for your questions, and Jared can answer various bits or all bits. So the gentleman there, the lady there, do we have the resources to do this? And the gentleman here, to start with.
Well, it was an interesting interview. I read recently of a phase that happened in the mid-1800s when the romantic novel became very prevalent, and people were worried about young women not sitting at the dinner table talking to their parents, but instead they were reading these romantic novels and becoming lost in a realm of fantasy. And the phrase you used was the tragedy of the modern generation. And obviously people were thinking this in the 1850s, and probably in the 1900s and 1950s. You're probably thinking about me, and I'm probably thinking about my daughter. Is it not just sort of the human condition to be worried about the tragedy of the modern generation, and the flexibility of the human brain seems to be that we always overcome it? We always get these addictions, whether it's the romantic novel or the first video games, which a young child today would see as completely pointless. I played a video game to my daughter from 30 years ago, and she thought it was just utterly, utterly boring. Yeah. And we all get addicted, on what the prevailing sort of moods of the time is.
Sure. I'll ask you to wait. I'm trying to get as many questions in as possible. The lady over there.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I was wondering whether with our system of justice, if you can call it that sometimes, there is a lot of anger and hatred generated by the outcomes. In a different sort of system where you've got these negotiating skills and what is that word? When they are talking to each other much more, when the problems are being solved between individuals so that the emotions are dealt with, do you actually end up with less anger and hatred in the society? Thank you.
I was
struck by what you said about New Guineans' attitudes to friendship, and how when you had that friend who got on very well with the New Guinean, and then after he'd gone, he said, "Oh well, I'll see you again, and we'll meet." And then the New Guinean said to you that why would he want to meet that man again? Why would he want to? I was interested if you could expand on friendship in New Guinea.
Well, thank you for 3 great questions. The first was, "'Twas ever thus."
Yeah.
Secondly, a better system of justice, not spreading anger quite so much, and then attitudes to friendship.
Sure. Yeah. There are 3 very good questions. Let me try to respond to them. The first question about the insidious effects of the romantic novel as perceived in the 1850s, is that different from the insidious effects of cell phones and computers as perceived today? You're correct that, of course, that each generation sees what the children are doing. The older people of a generation see what the children are doing as going downhill, and the older people look back to the previous generation as the paragon of virtues, and we're going downhill today. And yes, it is true that there's always that tendency to see the deterioration today. At the risk of being flip, I would say that today it's true. I am much more seriously concerned, and I think there's reason to be more seriously concerned about the effects of communication that is not face-to-face and that is not voice-to-voice. I see that as realistically with more potential for harm than the romantic novel. The question in back about the generation of anger by outcomes in our so-called system of justice, contrasting with, does the traditional system of justice succeed in getting rid of the anger? There's variation, but any of you who've been involved with the British or American court system know that a common, maybe the usual outcome is anger, and that our courts do nothing to discharge the anger between parties in a dispute, whereas in the New Guinea system, the focus is on diffusing the anger. Doesn't say that New Guineans always succeed in diffusing the anger. Sometimes they fail. But I'll give you an example of success at diffusing anger under what seemed to me very unlikely circumstances. One New Guinea friend of mine related to me that when his mother was pregnant with him, the tribe next door attacked his tribe and killed his father and killed other members of his clan. And so his clan were driven out of their ancestral lands for their own safety. And about 25 years later, negotiations went on when my friend negotiated with the clan that had killed his father in an attempt to restore peace. And my friend then told me the story. We managed to achieve peace, and we did it by, we had a pig feast, and we gave them a certain number of pigs. And I said, wait a minute. You've got it wrong. You gave them pigs, but they killed your father. They should have given you pigs. And he said, no, you don't understand it. The function of our system of reconciliation is not to determine the value of pigs and equalize the number of pigs. The purpose is to achieve a reconciliation of feelings, whatever it takes. And for us, yes, it cost us pigs, but we were able to move back to our ancestral lands and resume relationships with these people. And I remember, in fact, when I came back to that village a year and a half later, there was a batch of people from the other village, the village that had killed the father of my friend, and they were sitting there in the village of my friend with perfectly happy relations. So sometimes it works even under unlikely circumstances. And then finally, the example that you gave about the meaning of friendship in New Guinea is also, it's an example of broader interest because it illustrates that, at least for me, when I first went out to New Guinea, my reaction was how exotic they are. And then rather quickly, when I began talking with them, my conclusion was, these are people just like us. And then as I got to know them better, I realized that there are respects in which they really are different. And some of these respects were so basic that it took me years to notice them. And one was the different concept of friendship. That in the story in my book that you're referring to, I realized that in these very small societies where people don't come in from the outside, you don't make friends from the outside. Instead, if, say, a European comes in, the relationship with the European is that you want a job from him and you want money from him, but the idea of just having a friendship because you like him, there's no precedent for that. So it took me 8 years to realize this different concept of friendship. So these are three very interesting questions already.
And three very interesting answers, thank you. So, a forest of hands, hope we can get as many of you in as possible. So, the gentleman there, please. Gentleman there. And what do we have here? I won't forget the people at the back. The lady right at the back there. Oh, so
I've got people up in the gallery.
Oh yes, of course. So sorry. Okay, you're next. Okay, so if you start.
What's the Papua New Guinea up here attitude towards narcotics and addictive substances? And with your kind of very interesting way of looking at things, are there things we could learn from that?
There's someone in the middle first. Yeah, oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes.
Sorry, you want the question?
Yes, go ahead.
I've sort of got a slightly different experience of West Papua and Papua New Guinea in the sense that when we're talking about dietary issues, I experienced a lot of cannibals, and I did a film about a particular group. So their dietary interest was slightly different. But one particular thing, and they had diseases that related to cannibalism, specifically when they sort of were eating their own sort of tribal or kin or related.
So it's a CJD.
Yes, so that's aspects of problems that they face, dietary problems, and also tropical diseases that they have that we in the West have very little of, like malaria and parasitical worms and various other things. So I think there's a tendency to sort of see one society has, through rose-tinted glasses, has some very admirable things, obviously low in salt, low in other things, and salt is always, in the tropics, a very needed but very difficult to get sort of source of food. But they face different problems. Yes, I think equally there's values in comparing societies and learning from each other, but it's not always black and white because there's problems that they both face. Yeah, equally in judicial systems because...
so could you put the microphone...
Equally, sorry, in judicial systems, we were talking about legal systems. I recall that they killed and ate a particular person. He explained to me why he did it. Well, the person was stealing my sweet potatoes, so obviously, he was going to pay for that. So he felt he got a bargain because he got his sweet potatoes back and he got some meat thrown in. So, I thought that was quite interesting too.
Jared, I've enjoyed your previous books very much, and I've just started a new one, enjoying it so far. Guns, Germs and Steel, as far as I'm concerned, was a revelation. But I've more recently read, twice actually, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, who strongly suggests that the world is a better place everywhere, over whatever time scale you look, for virtually everyone. It's surprising because there's always going to be enough worrying news to fill the news of an evening, but we are statistically much less likely to come across problems than historically we were. I remember one statistic he talked about at the end of his book, and you alluded to it earlier on. 9/11, 3,000 people died. In the following year, 12,000 people died because instead of flying, they chose to drive. And driving is so much more risky than flying.
So do you have a question?
The point and the question is, I think that the world for virtually everyone is a better place than historically it was. And be interested to hear your comment on his book and his thesis.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, what are Papua New Guinea's attitude to narcotics? It's, in terms of diet, it's not always, they don't always have the best solution, and the modern world is, I think you answered the thing about the modern world. You kind of accept that it does have advantages, but start with the narcotics one first.
Sure. Yeah. Again, three very interesting, very different questions. To begin with the addictive substances and narcotics in not just PNG, but New Guinea in general, because New Guinea is divided between Papua New Guinea in the east and Indonesian New Guinea, alias Papua, in the west. Traditionally, there were mildly addictive substances, namely betel nut, and in the lowlands, lots of people chewed betel nut. It's a mild narcotic. Modern narcotics, there is, at least in Papua New Guinea, an influx of modern drugs which are involved in a trade of drugs versus weapons. But at least betel nut addiction is widespread in New Guinea and in Indonesia, and seems, because it's a mild narcotic, far less damaging than heroin and the narcotics that we're used to. Second point, three points that I bring out of your comment. It's not black and white. I would say the essence of my book is, yes, it's not black and white. There are things that I think we can emulate, and there are things to which we can say, thank God it's passed in traditional societies. As for cannibalism, the first group that I work with in New Guinea is the group probably to which you're referring. I first worked with the Foray. The Foray, at the time that I was there, the majority of deaths of Foray adults were due to what in effect is Creutzfeldt Jakob, that was transmitted by cannibalism, which ended in the late 1950s. And nowadays, but it's got a very long latency of decades, and nowadays, although the last episode of cannibalism in the Foray area was around 57, 58, nowadays I'm told that each year there's still maybe one person in the Foray area coming down with kuru as a result of infection as recently as 1957. So that's a latency period of 56 years. Very long latency period. And finally, tropical diseases and parasites. Yes, I certainly don't want to leave the impression that our non-communicable diseases mean that we're healthy and they are healthy. They have their own health problems and they're different. And you're correct that the primary health problems that they have are infectious tropical diseases, parasitic diseases, and traditionally starvation, including skin diseases. Yeah. Then Steve Pinker's recent book, That the World is a Better Place Today. To some extent, Steve is specific, but I think he may also be making a more general point. The specific issue is in levels of violence between traditional and modern state-level societies. And there are scholars who've tabulated levels of violence. There's a lot of variation in levels of violence among modern state-level societies. Sweden hasn't had a war in how many centuries? Germany has had a couple of wars in the 20th century. Again, traditional societies, there are traditional societies where level of violence is extremely low. There are traditional societies with a high level of violence. On the average, Steve Pinker has gone through the numbers and various others have. On the average, the level of violence is higher in traditional societies than in modern state-level societies. On the average, for reasons because there are not the societal mechanisms to monopolize the use of force, and so people turn to violence if they cannot get satisfaction themselves. On the broader question about the world being a better place to live in today, in some respects the world is a better place to live in today. We have the Royal Institution, we have Covent Garden, we have a secure diet. We have wonderful journalists from whom we can learn. We live longer lives. In those respects, the world is a better place today. The big question is whether the world is going to be a better place 30 years from now, because at the rate at which we are going depleting world resources, we are on a non-sustainable course. We may be a ticking time bomb, and unless we get onto a sustainable economy, you can be sure that the world will not be operating at a first world level of standard of living 30 or 40 years from now, unless we do two things. Unless we reduce our overall consumption rate and get onto sustainable consumption, and unless we equalize standards of living between countries around the world, because nowadays the poor countries out there where people are dissatisfied have ways such as 9/11 venting their wrath at rich countries. And so if Steve and others say the world is a better place to live today, in certain respects it is, but it's up for grabs whether the world is going to be a horrible place to live 50 years from now. And I don't know what the result of that is going to be. Depends upon how the younger generation votes and how our politicians deal with world problems. My American politicians today are not a good role model.
Well, some are, some aren't. Now, so the lady there. And after that lady, if you could go to that gentleman over there, there's a hand over there.
Thank you so much. Jared, it's such a privilege to get the opportunity to hear you speak. I now wonder how we can help you. And I say this with, of course, a twinkle in my eye. But I wonder what research questions you would like young scholars like myself tackle, and what questions you still have that you would like us to broach, specifically relating to ways to move towards a more integrated and authentic lifestyle in communities and across societies. Thank you.
Jared, I'd just like to ask you, with your friends you have in Papua New Guinea, would you not like to share with them the benefits of the modern world, like better medicine, better agricultural techniques, the great cultural wealth of the modern world, and the joys of the iPhone or whatever it is? Or are you determined that you'd like to keep them shut off from those things?
And there was a gentleman, just I saw around there. Yeah.
It's a question from a law professor, right? I mean, I'm interested in this issue about negotiating just outcomes. And I think in our society, one of the reasons why it's so hard to achieve is pride and ego. Are our egos bigger?
So those are three interesting questions for you. What research should young people undertake? How can they help you? Can you shut people from Papua New Guinea off? Would you like to shut people off? And are our egos too big?
Okay, first question. Help with my own research? Yes, over the next 4 or 5 years. I would love help in understanding what happened in Britain in the last 50 years, what happened in Japan in the late 1800s, and what's happening in Japan today, what is happening in the United States today, what happened in Germany with unification and reunification. So I have lots of selfish research interest, but I think the big question the important question is not Jared Diamond's next book, but the important question is, how do we get onto a sustainable economy? Because we know perfectly well, there are lots of people that know perfectly well that our economy is non-sustainable. We know perfectly well how to manage fisheries sustainably. You in the UK are managing the River Thames herring fishery sustainably. We off the US West Coast are managing the Alaska wild salmon fishery sustainably. The challenge is, what can we do to get people to manage all the world's fisheries sustainably and all the world's forests sustainably, and to manage agriculture sustainably so that we're not losing topsoil That's the big question. Secondly, the second question about sharing the benefits of the modern world with PNG or keep them shut off. A frequent misconception that people have in the first world is that it's our choice whether we here bring them there the benefits of civilization, or why don't we leave them to carry on in their traditional ways. The choice is not ours. New Guineans know perfectly well what there is available in the outside world, and it's New Guineans who are making these choices. New Guineans cannot be cut off in an anthropological, zoological garden. Most New Guineans have already been contacted. Those few who haven't been contacted have seen the airplanes flying overhead and are in contact with groups that have been contacted. New Guineans will choose themselves. There are some things that New Guineans want. When I hired my first New Guineans and paid them for their bird work, and I asked them, what are you going to do with the money that I just paid you? Here I get to see what they want in Western society. One of my men said, what I'm going to do is buy an umbrella. And I thought, my God, is that the best that Western society can offer? But then I reflected, this is an area where rainfall is 400 inches per year. It makes very good sense to buy an umbrella. So New Guineans are making their own decisions about what they want from Western society and what they don't want from Western society. And it's not, our choices are irrelevant. The final question about negotiating just outcomes, are our egos bigger? I have not detected average differences in ego between New Guineans and Americans, but then I don't have a reliable ego meter for quantifying egos in New Guineans and Americans, and so I don't know the answer to the question.
Thank you. Now, just want to check, can we just run a few minutes over time? I'd like to just get 3 more questions in. Jason, is that all right? Yeah. Great. So, just who to choose. Back rows always get forgotten. So that lady there, if there's someone who can get a microphone to her. Who from the centre? Right at the back there. And from the middle, who to choose? The lady with the glasses. Gentleman, I beg your pardon. So Robin Day always used to do that, and I confess I'm very short-sighted. So shall we start with you, since I hurt your feelings?
I was really interested in your discussion about responsibility and how it affected childhood. I think at the moment there seems to be a lot of debate around how far people should take personal responsibility for their actions. So, for example, Jared, in the UK, the government are currently talking about how far people should be held responsible for decisions they may have made over their lifestyle choices when it comes to things like jobs or healthcare. What's the attitude of traditional societies to personal responsibility? Are they held responsible personally, or does society step in? And if it's different to today, are they better for it?
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Very interesting talk, thank you very much. I'm interested in how they work with nature to find cures for disease and other such things. And have they found drugs from their own natural plants and so forth that we haven't discovered in the West, and could we learn from them?
Thank you. And finally?
I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the issue of race relations within sort of Papua New Guinean societies like that, where people have often been living in very sort of isolated, ethnically homogenous areas, and how that differs from modern society at all.
Thank you very much.
Could you repeat the last question?
So, do you just mind talking about race? So your point was, how does race relations work in Papua New Guinea? Are you talking about between Papua New Guineans themselves, or to outsiders?
Between European outsider types and between sort of different ethnic groups within Papua New Guinea.
So whether they embrace newcomers.
Yeah.
So personal responsibility, natural cures, and race relations.
Okay. Personal responsibility. Let me talk about personal responsibility regards children, because I think this is the most interesting part of it. Amidst the variation in traditional societies, a theme that stands out is that it's much commoner to regard children as having personal responsibility for their actions. And this is an unpleasant example that carries it to an extreme, but when I began working in the highlands of New Guinea, I was struck by the fact that most people have obviously burn scars on their arms, and I assumed that they had gotten burned as adults making fires, but no. Most of these burn scars were developed in childhood or infancy with children playing too close to fires. And the belief is that a child is responsible for the consequences of his or her own actions, and which includes that the child has to learn not to get burned. To us, that seems like an extreme placing of responsibility on children, but the fact is that most New Guinea children survive, not just in New Guinea, but African children and South American Indian children survive, and the expression that one frequently finds in accounts by Western observers is the belief put in Daniel Everett's book for the Paraha Indians that every individual has to be strong and stand on his or her own feet, and every individual depends ultimately on himself or herself. This is not to say that there's lots of tribal support, but you have to stand on your own feet and have your own strength, number one. Number two, finding cures for disease. Yes, again, wherever I go around in New Guinea, I ask people, so what do you do about malaria? What do you do about intestinal upset? And people will often show me a particular plant, and they'll say, oh, we use that plant for dysentery, and we use that plant for contraception, we use that plant for malaria. Any of you familiar with the pharmaceutical industry know that the pharmaceutical industry pays for biopharmaceutical exploration, that's to say, sends people out to traditional societies around the world, asks people to bring in plants that are of medicinal value, and then some of those plants get sent back and tested in laboratories to see which of them may be of use as drugs. And I believe a prime example is a drug in, some of you will know the answer to this, but I believe in Madagascar, a particularly valuable drug is one that was discovered by traditional people in Madagascar. I'm forgetting now whether it is effective against malaria or something else, but there's a whole large field in the pharmaceutical industry of exploiting traditional knowledge of medicines. And then finally, relations between ethnic groups in Papua New Guinea. Situation is different in Indonesia and New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, first of all, there are the 1,000 different indigenous groups, and then there are the recent arrivals, the Asians and the Europeans. The indigenous groups, there is often tension between indigenous groups. There's often fighting between indigenous groups. Traditionally there was, but traditional fighting in New Guinea was as likely to be within an ethnic group or within a language group as between language groups. And again, one vignette standing out of my mind is being in a remote village. It happened to be in Indonesian New Guinea, where I was in one village and we looked down in the distance and there was another village about 1.5 miles away. And in the other village, which I walked to, the people spoke the same language. And the first village that I was in, they explained to me the people in that village down there used to be our traditional enemies, and we fought with them and we killed each other, even though the village was visible, was 1.5 miles away, and they spoke the same language. Ethnic relations between Europeans and Asians and New Guineans themselves. There are incidents, but I must say things have gone in Papua New Guinea since independence in 1975, far better than the pessimists feared. It is not the case that all the whites got killed. There are many whites who've taken out Papua New Guinea citizenship. There are whites who get elected to the New Guinea PNG parliament in open electorates. There are whites and there are Asians who have served as prime ministers and cabinet ministers. So I would say that ethnic relations have been surprisingly good in Papua New Guinea. And I think that's the 3 questions.
Yes, it is. Jared, thank you very much. I know that there are lots of you that didn't get to ask questions, I probably shouldn't say this, but one sneaky way of getting a question to Jared is to buy one of his books, which he'll sign afterwards. It might delay you all leaving, which is why I shouldn't recommend it, but go ahead and do it. And thanks, first of all, to you all for being such a great audience. There were some great questions, and I wish I could have taken some more of them. And thanks most of all to Jared. You know, not just with this book, but throughout your writing, you've raised the big questions. And you've said this evening that, you know, the future of the world, the quality of our lives is up for grabs. And we can only make informed choices about how to go forward and make those choices if we know where we've come from and why things have happened. And you, through your writing, have enabled us better, you've equipped us better to make those choices. So thank you for that, and thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you.